Hand over the keys, you useless old man. That car is wasted on you. My son-in-law Brandon's words echoed through the crowded restaurant like a shot in the silence. All conversation stopped. Forks were suspended in midair. 50 pairs of eyes turned to our table, where my son Jessica remained silent, staring at his plate as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. "Brandon, please," I murmured, feeling his face burn with shame as whispers began at the surrounding tables. "Please nothing," he continued, her voice growing in volume and arrogance. "You drive a $70,000 Camaro convertible while you can barely pay your bills. It's ridiculous. Jessica and I need reliable transportation for the baby on the way." My name is Mark Thompson. I'm 65 years old, have been a widower for 8 years, and work part-time at an auto repair shop in the suburbs of Atlanta. To anyone looking at our table at that moment, I was exactly what I appeared to be, an older man wearing a faded flannel shirt, oil-stained jeans, and worn work boots. Brandon, on the other hand, was impeccable in his $1,000 suit, Rolex watch gleaming on his wrist, hair perfectly combed. At 32, he was everything that her apparently was not: successful, educated, refined. What he didn't know was that this humble appearance had been a careful choice I had made decades ago. "Dad," Jessica finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe Brandon is right. Do you really need such an expensive car? I mean, to go to the repair shop." The betrayal in the words of her daughter, hurt more than any insult Brandon could come up with. This was the girl I had raised alone after her mother died, whom I had sent to college, who had walked down the aisle with me at his wedding 2 years ago. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Brandon continued, slamming his hand on the table hard enough to make the plates rattle. "The old man is having a delayed midlife crisis. Spending money he doesn't have on sports cars while her family is in need." The words "in need" almost made me laugh, but I kept my expression neutral. If he only knew how many times in the last 2 years I had secretly transferred money to her account to cover the rent, the credit card bills, even the payment for the suit he was wearing at that moment. "Brandon's right, Dad," Jessica sighed, finally looking me in the eye. "You're getting older. Driving a car like that, it's dangerous for someone his age. And we really need something bigger for when the baby comes." As she spoke, I observed the other customers in the restaurant. Some seemed uncomfortable with the public scene. Others whispered among themselves, clearly judging the situation. A woman at the next table shook her head pityingly, as if I were a pathetic old man being scolded by her responsible family. Brandon leaned forward, his eyes shining with a mixture of greed and condescension. "Look, Mark, I'll be blunt with you. Jessica is 5 months pregnant. We need a reliable car. His Camaro is perfect. In exchange, you can have my sedan. It's more appropriate for someone in her situation." "I need to think about it," I said calmly, starting to get up. "Think about what?" Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that made several people turn around. "There's nothing to think about. You're going to hand over those keys today, or we'll have to take more drastic measures." More drastic measures. The threat hung in the air between us. I walked to the exit with my back hunched, listening to the whispers follow him like a toxic cloud. In the parking lot, he stopped beside his red Camaro, running his hand over the flawless paint. This car wasn't just a vehicle. It was one of the few things that allowed him to remember that he was more than he appeared to be. As I drove home, my mind returned to the conversation I had had with my lawyer, Richard, the week before. He had warned me that this moment would come sooner or later. "Mark," he had said, "you can't keep secretly financing his life forever. At some point, she's going to start feeling entitled to more than you're willing to give." And now that moment had arrived. If you're enjoying this story of how arrogance can blind people to the truth, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see how this situation unfolded in a way Brandon could never have imagined. That night, sitting in my small, simple house, looking at the papers scattered on the dining room table, I knew it was time for Brandon and Jessica to find out exactly who the man was that they had just publicly humiliated. The first time Brandon disrespected him was a year and a half ago, during Jessica's baby shower. I had arrived with a simple gift, a set of blankets and clothes I found at a department store. Nothing fancy, but chosen with care. "Really, Mark?" Brandon had whispered loud enough for several people to hear. "Department store clothes for my son?" Jessica deserved better than that. What he didn't know was that 3 days earlier, I had transferred $2,500 to his account to cover their overdue rent. The same rent they couldn't pay because Brandon spent more on corporate lunches than I did on food in an entire month. Jessica had lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed, but didn't say a word in my defense. That was the moment I realized how Brandon had managed to isolate her from me, planting seeds of shame about her humble origins. In the months that followed, the humiliations became more frequent and calculated. Brandon developed a pattern. There was always an audience when he decided to put me down. There were always witnesses to what he called necessary conversations about my inadequacy as a father and grandfather. Jessica, he would say during our monthly family dinners, you need to talk to your father about those flannel shirts. When our baby is born, we can't have grandpa looking like a construction worker every time we go out in public. The irony was devastating. Brandon worked as a sales manager at a used car dealership, earning about $45,000 a year. His $1,000 suit had been purchased on credit whose minimum payments I had been secretly covering through birthday gifts and emergency assistance. Jessica had become a strange version of herself. The boy who grew up playing in my workshop, who helped me change oil and didn't mind getting his hands dirty, now talked about appropriate social standards and the need to keep up appearances. Dad, she had said to me 3 weeks ago, during one of our increasingly rare conversations, Brandon is right about some things. You're getting older. Maybe it's time to think about retiring completely, selling the house, and moving into one of those senior living communities. It would be safer. What she didn't know was that, while she was talking about financial security, I had just paid her premium health insurance, a $1,200 a month benefit that Brandon had lost when he was fired from his previous job for falsifying sales reports. Brandon's manipulation was subtle but systematic. He had convinced Jessica that my insistence on working in the workshop was stubborn and dangerous. That my car was a symbol of senile irresponsibility. That her refusal to move to a more appropriate place was pure selfishness. Your father is living in the past, I heard him say during a phone call I didn't know I could listen in on. Men his age need to accept their limitations. It's natural for us, as the younger generation, to take on certain responsibilities. Responsibilities. As if driving his own car or living in his own house were privileges he had to earn. Over the past 18 months, Brandon had developed a particular obsession with his Camaro. Every time we met, there was a joke, a comment, a suggestion about how that car was wasted in his hands. Mark, be honest with me, he had said 2 weeks ago as we walked to the parking lot after another tense dinner. When was the last time you really enjoyed that car? When was the last time you accelerated, felt the adrenaline rush? Men of his age should prioritize comfort and practicality. What Brandon didn't understand was that this Camaro represented much more than transportation. It was a symbol of the life that his choice to live, a life where appearances didn't define a person's worth. But there was something deeper to her obsession with the car. Over the past few months, I had noticed how he looked at the Camaro. It was the same look I saw when he looked at the houses of wealthier neighbors, when she leafed through catalogs of products she couldn't afford, when she mentally calculated how much money other people had. Brandon wasn't just arrogant. He was desperately greedy. Her financial situation was even worse than Jessica imagined. Through casual conversations with mutual acquaintances and some discreet research, I discovered that Brandon owed more than $70,000 on credit cards. The luxurious apartment where they lived cost $3,200 a month, more than 70% of his net income. His car payment consumed another $800 a month. They were sinking financially, and Brandon had identified what he saw as his solution, me. In his mind, I was a naive old man with a valuable car and a house of my own, wasting resources that could solve all his problems. He didn't see a father who deserved respect. He saw an opportunity. Jessica's pregnancy had intensified his pressure. Now he wasn't just suggesting changes in my life, he was demanding them. And he was using the baby as an emotional weapon. Jessica is stressed about our son's financial future, he had told me last week. Seeing you make irresponsible choices with money doesn't help her anxiety. As a future grandfather, shouldn't he be prioritizing the stability of the family? Every word was calculated to make him feel guilty, selfish, inadequate. But Brandon had made one crucial mistake in all these months of manipulation. He had assumed he was exactly what he appeared to be. An old blue-collar worker with limited resources and little sophistication. As I walked through her house that night after the restaurant, past the simple furniture and walls with faded photographs, I reflected on how surprised he would be if he knew about the conversation I had scheduled for the next morning. A meeting that would completely change her understanding of who he had chosen as his target. A meeting that would reveal exactly how much money an old factory worker could have, and how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone with decades of experience in keeping secrets. While Brandon slept that night, probably dreaming of the keys to his Camaro, I was awake reviewing documents he would never imagine he possessed. Documents that would show him very soon the true cost of confusing kindness with weakness. The call came the next morning as I was having breakfast in the kitchen of my small house. It was Jessica, and her voice carried an urgency that made me stop chewing my toast. Dad, we need to talk. Brandon he's very worried about you. Worried about me. The irony was so thick I could cut it with a knife. Jessica, about yesterday at the restaurant. Dad, you can't go on like this, she interrupted me, and I could hear Brandon talking in the background. Driving that car at his age, refusing help from family, living alone in that house with no supervision. Brandon has researched this. Men her age who live in isolation are 70% more likely to develop early dementia. Early dementia. Brandon had escalated his manipulation tactics to a new level. Now he wasn't just questioning my financial responsibility, but my sanity. Researched where? I asked calmly, though I could feel anger rising in my chest. Online, Dad. There are studies. Brandon wants you to know that we're not doing this to benefit ourselves. It's genuine concern for your health and safety. Through the kitchen window, I saw my neighbor Robert Hendricks watering his roses. Robert was 72 years old, rode a Harley-Davidson motorcycle, and had just returned from a solo trip through Colorado. Apparently, Brandon hadn't included men like Robert in her research. Where is Brandon now? I asked. He had to leave early for a very important meeting. But Dad, he left some informational brochures about assisted living facilities in the area. Really nice places, with activities, 24-hour medical care. As Jessica continued with her rehearsed presentation, my mind drifted back to the phone conversation I had accidentally overheard 3 weeks ago. Brandon talking to someone about speeding up the process, and how the old man was being more stubborn than expected. At the time, I thought it was about his work. Now I understood that I was the project that needed to be sped up. 2 hours later, Jessica appeared at my door with a manila folder and the expression of someone carrying out an unpleasant but necessary mission. Dad, I brought some information I thought you'd like to see, she said, sitting down at my kitchen table as she had done 1,000 times when she was a child. But the woman sitting there was no longer the little girl who played in the workshop and helped me fix cars. This Jessica wore expensive clothes, carried a designer bag, and looked at me with the same condescension I had seen in Brandon's eyes. Look at this, she said, spreading colorful brochures across the table. Sunset Manor has an 18-hole golf course. Golden Years offers pottery and gardening classes. And this one, pointing to a particularly elegant brochure, Pine Valley has 1-bedroom apartments with lake views and housekeeping included. Each brochure looked more like an advertisement for a luxury resort than a nursing home. Prices starting at $4,200 a month. Jessica, I said calmly, do you really believe I need 24-hour supervision? She hesitated for a moment, and for a split second, I saw a glimpse of the daughter I knew. But then her expression hardened again. Dad, you almost crashed the car last week. That was news to me. When was that? Brandon saw his ex-girlfriend pulling out of the supermarket parking lot too fast. He almost hit a van. It had never happened. It was such a blatant lie that it momentarily left him speechless. Brandon was fabricating incidents to build a case against his competence. And 2 weeks ago, you forgot Mrs. Patterson's name at the bank. That was also false. I had known Martha Patterson for 15 years and had never forgotten his name. But I saw the pattern. Brandon was creating a narrative of mental decline using fabricated incidents that no one else had witnessed. Jessica, these things never happened. Dad, that's exactly what Brandon said he would say. Denial is one of the first signs. The manipulation was so systematic and calculated that for a moment I felt something close to admiration for Brandon's audacity. He had turned his own daughter into a psychological weapon against him. How long did you spend planning this? I asked. Planning what? Jessica looked genuinely confused. This campaign to have him declared incompetent. Dad! She exclaimed, rising from her chair. No one is trying to have him declared incompetent. We're trying to help him before it's too late. But I could see the truth in her eyes. She knew. Perhaps not consciously, but on some level, Jessica knew she was participating in an orchestrated manipulation. That afternoon, after Jessica left with her unused flyers and an expression of frustration, I called Richard Castellanos, his lawyer of 15 years. "Richard, I need to see you. Today." "Mark, what happened?" "My son-in-law is trying to have me forcibly committed, and my daughter is helping him." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I thought the call had dropped. "Richard." "Mark, are you sure about this?" I spent the next 20 minutes telling Richard about the last 18 months. The increasing humiliations, the fabricated incidents, the systematic campaign to portray me as senile and incompetent. "Mark," Richard said when I finished, "you know that he can't be involuntarily committed without extensive legal proceedings, right?" "I know that. But I also know that Brandon is smarter than he looks. He won't try anything illegal. He'll build a case so convincing that even a judge will believe it." Richard sighed deeply. "What do you want me to do?" "First, I want you to investigate Brandon's real financial situation. Everything. Debts, income, assets, credit history. I want to know exactly how desperate he is." "And second?" "Second," I said, looking out the window at the Camaro in his garage, "it's time to remind Brandon and Jessica who I really am." That night, sitting in his worn armchair, reviewing documents he had kept in a safety deposit box for years, he began to devise a plan that would change everything. Brandon wanted my car. He wanted my house. He wanted to turn me into a helpless old man who depended on the kindness of his family to survive. He had based his entire strategy on the assumption that I was exactly what I appeared to be, a retired mechanic with limited resources and no real power. But while Brandon was weaving his web of lies and manipulation, I was about to teach him a very valuable lesson about the consequences of underestimating someone. A lesson about why you should never assume you know the whole story of a person just because you know the facade she chooses to show the world. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in over a year. When the familiar voice answered, I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Tom, it's Mark Thompson. I need to reactivate some accounts that have been dormant." "And Tom? It'll be a pleasure working with you again." The game was about to change completely. And Brandon had no idea what was coming his way. The meeting with Richard the next morning took place at his office in downtown Atlanta, a 15-story building I had helped finance discreetly 10 years earlier. Richard didn't know that, of course. Few knew the true extent of my silent investments scattered throughout the city. "Mark," Richard said, spreading documents across the polished mahogany desk, "what I found out about Brandon is even worse than his imagination." The papers showed a cascade of debt that would make any sensible person file for bankruptcy immediately. $123,000 in credit cards spread across 8 different banks. 2 personal loans worth $40,000 each, with interest rates of 29%. A car loan that consumed $1,200 a month for a vehicle that was already worth less than half the amount owed. "But here's the interesting part," Richard continued, pointing to a specific document. Brandon applied for 3 different loans using her house as collateral. He lied about his income on all 3 applications. Bank fraud. Brandon wasn't just greedy, he was criminally desperate. And there's more. Richard picked up another file. He contacted 5 law firms in the last 6 weeks asking about interdiction proceedings for the elderly. Specifically, about how to prove mental incapacity in relatives who resist care. My suspicion had been confirmed. Brandon wasn't just planning to publicly humiliate her, he was building a legal case to declare her mentally incompetent and take control of her assets. "Richard, I need you to do a few more things for me." "Tell me." "First, I want you to hire a private investigator to document everything Brandon does over the next 2 weeks. Every move, every conversation, every lie he tells about me. Second, I need you to prepare emergency documents protecting all my assets in case he tries something drastic. Third, I need you to do a few more things for me." Richard quickly took notes. "And third?" "Third," I smiled for the first time in weeks, "it's time to activate some resources that have been dormant for too long." After leaving Richard's office, I drove to an address he hadn't visited in over 2 years. Thompson Investments occupied 3 entire floors of one of Atlanta's most expensive buildings, with a panoramic view of the city I had watched grow for decades. Tom Bradley welcomed me into his executive office with the familiarity of someone who had managed my investments for 15 years. "Mark, when you called yesterday, I almost fell out of my chair," Tom said, pouring coffee into fine china cups. "It's been 2 years since we last discussed your active portfolios. Let's just say a situation has arisen that requires immediate attention." Tom opened a confidential file and began reading numbers that would have made Brandon faint on the spot. His primary portfolio is valued at $8.3 million. The commercial real estate generates a net monthly income of $120,000. The technology stocks we bought in 2010 have multiplied 18 times. As Tom spoke, I thought about how Brandon would react to learning that the useless old worker he despised had more net worth than he would ever see in his entire life. "Tom, I need to reactivate some specific investments. And I need to do it in a way that certain individuals will notice. What kind of move do you have in mind?" I explained my situation with Brandon, omitting only the most personal details about Jessica. Tom listened quietly, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. "Mark," he said when I finished, "this is more common than you might think. We have other clients dealing with families that have become financial predators. The difference is that he has resources to protect himself in ways that most people don't." "Exactly." That afternoon, Tom and I developed a 3-phase plan. Phase 1, make certain financial transactions visible to specific people who knew Brandon. Phase 2, activate investments that would generate attention in circles where Brandon was trying to establish himself socially. Phase 3, what Tom called an educational demonstration of financial firepower. Meanwhile, the private investigator Richard had hired was already producing results. Mike Santos, a former Atlanta police detective, called me that evening with a preliminary report that confirmed my worst fears. Mr. Thompson, his son-in-law, spent the entire afternoon visiting expensive nursing homes in North Atlanta. He was asking about admission procedures for patients whose family needs to make decisions for them. Brandon was accelerating his schedule, probably because he had realized that his financial situation was rapidly deteriorating and he needed a solution before everything fell apart. "Mike, I need you to document everything. Every visit, every conversation, every person he talks to. And I want everything legally admissible in court." "Understood. There's one more thing, Mrs. Thompson. Your daughter wasn't with him today. But I overheard a phone conversation where he told someone that the old man will be in an institution by Christmas, whether he likes it or not. Until Christmas. That gave me less than 3 months to act." The next morning, Jessica showed up at my door unannounced, wearing an expression of determination I hadn't seen since she was a teenager. "Dad, we need to talk about yesterday." Brandon was very upset by her reaction to the nursing home brochures. "Jessica, sit down," I said, pointing to the armchair in the living room where she used to do her homework as a child. "There are things you need to know about Brandon." But before I could continue, she raised her hand to interrupt me. "Dad, Brandon told me you called lawyers yesterday. He said you're trying to cause legal problems for our family." Brandon's manipulation had reached a new level. Now he was using distorted truths to strengthen his control over Jessica. "Jessica, Brandon is lying to you about a lot of things." "Like what?" This was my chance to plant some seeds of truth before it was too late. If he's following this story and wants to see how families can be destroyed by greed, be sure to subscribe to the channel to find out all the revelations to come. "Jessica, do you know how much Brandon makes a year?" "Sure, about $80,000. He makes $45,000. And he owes $123,000 on credit cards." I saw the confidence in his face falter for the first time in months. "How do you know that?" "Because I've been secretly paying many of your bills for the past 2 years, thinking I was helping my daughter through a difficult phase." Jessica was silent for a long moment, processing this information. "Dad, that's impossible. Brandon always shows me the bank statements." "Jessica, Brandon is planning to have me committed and take control of my assets. He visited 5 lawyers about interdiction proceedings and 3 nursing homes yesterday." Tears began to form in her eyes, but she shook her head vigorously. "No, Dad. Brandon would never do that. He loves me. We love each other." She stood up abruptly and walked to the door. "Jessica," I called before she left, When he finds out the truth, and he will find out very soon, remember that he will always be welcome here. No matter what happens with Brandon. She stood at the door, without turning around, for almost a full minute. Then she left without saying a word. That night, reviewing all the documents Tom and Richard had prepared, I realized I had reached the point of no return. It no longer mattered to try to save my relationship with Jessica gradually. Brandon had forced a situation where I needed to act drastically or lose everything, my freedom, my assets, and any chance of opening my daughter's eyes. I picked up the phone and called Tom. Tom, it's Mark. Tomorrow we begin phase 2. It was time for Brandon to find out exactly with whom he had chosen to mess with. And when the dust settled, he would know that underestimating a quiet man can be the most expensive mistake of anyone's life. Phase 1 of my plan began on a Monday at 9 in the morning, when Brandon arrived at work at Prestige Motors to find that he had lost his job. Mr. Williams, the general manager, Robert Martinez, had told him, "We have received information about irregularities in his sales reports. We're going to have to let him go immediately." What Brandon didn't know was that Robert Martinez had received a call from Tom Bradley the previous Friday. Tom, representing an investor interested in opportunities in the automotive field, had casually mentioned his concern about questionable practices he had heard about involving certain employees at Prestige Motors. While Brandon was trying to process his sudden dismissal, Phase 2 was already in motion. Mike Santos, the private investigator, had delivered a complete dossier on Brandon's fraudulent debts to 3 different banks. That dossier would reach the right desks on Tuesday. Jessica called me on Tuesday night, her voice thick with panic. "Dad, something terrible is happening. Brandon lost his job, and now the banks are calling about late payments that he said were up to date." "What kind of payments, Jessica?" "Credit cards, loans. Dad," he told her, "we only had $5,000 in debt. But they're talking about over 100,000. I kept my voice calm and compassionate. "Jessica, where is Brandon now?" "He went out to try to work this out with the banks. He said it's all a misunderstanding, but Dad," his voice broke, "I'm scared." On Wednesday, Brandon showed up at my door. His $1,000 suit was wrinkled, his hair was messy, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The arrogance was completely gone. "Mark, I need to talk to you," he said, trying to regain some control in his voice. "Sure, Brandon. Come in." We sat at the same kitchen table where he had humiliated me countless times. But now the tables had turned. "Mark, I know we've had our differences, but we're family. And family helps each other out, right? Differences. As if systematic humiliation and conspiring to rob me were mere differences. What do you need, Brandon?" "I need a loan. $50,000. It's temporary, I swear. Just until I can get another job and clear up these misunderstandings with the banks." $50,000. From his who 3 days earlier had called me a useless old man in public. Brandon, where do you think he would get $50,000? His car, the house. He can refinance, use it as collateral. "Mark, I'm desperate here." Desperate. Finally, an honest word coming out of her mouth. "Brandon, I need to ask you something. Why did you visit 5 law firms asking about interdiction proceedings?" The blood drained from his face completely. "How did you?" "I never." "Why did you visit 3 nursing homes asking about involuntary admissions?" Her hands began to shake. "Mark, you don't understand. Why did you lie to Jessica about your income? Why did you forge bank statements? Why did you make up stories about me almost crashing the car?" Each question was a hammer blow to the wall of lies he had built. I could see his brain working frantically, trying to calculate how much I knew and how I had found out. "Mark, you have to understand. We're going bankrupt. Jessica is pregnant. I had to find a solution." So her solution was to have me committed and steal her assets? "It wasn't stealing," he exploded, rising from his chair. "It was protection. You're old, Mark. Men his age make terrible financial mistakes. I was trying to protect my son's future." There it was. The raw truth behind months of psychological manipulation. "Brandon," I said calmly, "sit down." Something in my tone made him obey immediately. "Do you want to know how I found out about the lawyers and the nursing homes?" He nodded, her hands still shaking. I hired a private investigator who documented every move of his over the last 3 weeks. Every lie he told, every debt he hid, every attempt to make me look incompetent. I picked up a folder from the chair beside me and placed it on the table. Here are photographs of her entering law offices. Audio recordings of her inquiring about interdiction proceedings. Actual bank statements showing her debts of $123,000. Brandon stared at her folder as if it contained a bomb ready to explode. But there's one thing you don't know, Brandon. One thing that will completely change his understanding of who you've chosen to target. I opened the folder and pulled out a document that made his eyes widen in utter shock. This is her bank statement, Brandon. From just one of her accounts. The paper showed a balance of $2.6 million. My total portfolio is valued at $8.3 million. My commercial properties generate $120,000 a month in net income. Brandon was speechless, looking alternately at the document and her face. Impossible, he whispered. You work in a garage. You drive an old car. You wear. I choose to live simply, Brandon. For privacy. For security. And to see the true character of the people around her. I pulled another document from the folder. Do you know who has been paying his bills for the last 2 years? Who covered his rent when he was late? Who paid the minimum payments on his credit cards? I showed him a list of bank transfers totaling over $80,000. He, the useless old man you despised, was secretly financing her life of luxury. Brandon fell back in his chair as if he had been punched in the stomach. But that's not all, I continued, pulling out the last document. This is the report on his banking crimes. Falsification of income reports, loan application fraud, use of false information to obtain credit. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold the paper. Mark, I didn't know, if I had known who you really were. If you had known, would you have treated me with respect? No, Brandon. You would have tried to manipulate me in even more elaborate ways. My phone rang. It was Richard. Mark, everything is ready. The documentation has been delivered to the banks and the appropriate authorities. Thank you, Richard. Brandon looked at me with growing horror. What have you done? I protected my family from a financial predator, I replied calmly. I protected my daughter from a man who lied about everything from the first day of our marriage. You can't do this to me. Jessica is pregnant. We're family. Family doesn't try to forcibly commit relatives to steal his assets, Brandon. At that moment, we heard a key in the door. Jessica had arrived. Brandon? Dad? Why are you guys? She stopped when she saw the open briefcase on the table, the scattered documents, and the look of utter terror on his husband's face. Jessica, I said softly, I need to show you something. It was time for the final revelation that would change everything forever. Jessica stared at the documents scattered on the table as if they were evidence of a horrible crime. Her hand trembled as he picked up the bank statement showing my true financial situation. $8.3 million, she whispered, looking alternately at the paper and her face. Dad, is this real? Completely real, Jessica. And there's more. I showed her the list of transfers I had secretly made over the past 2 years. $80,000 keeping them afloat financially, while Brandon publicly humiliated me. No, she murmured, tears beginning to roll down his cheeks. Brandon told me that he had asked you to borrow money. He said it was he who was helping you. Brandon finally found his voice, but now it sounded desperate and pathetic. Jessica, I can explain all this. His father is twisting the facts. Twisting. I calmly stood up and grabbed my phone. Jessica, I want you to listen to something. I played a recording that Mike Santos had captured 3 days earlier. Brandon's voice was crystal clear. The old man will be in an institution by Christmas, whether he likes it or not. Jessica is so manipulated that she'll sign any paper I put in front of her. Once I have legal control over his assets, we'll be free of all these debts. The blood drained completely from Jessica's face. She looked at Brandon with an expression of utter horror that I will never forget. You plan to use me to institutionalize my own father? Brandon stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair. Jessica, you have to understand. We were going bankrupt. His father is old, he doesn't need all that money. It was the perfect solution for all of us. Perfect solution? Jessica screamed for the first time in her life that I can remember. You were going to make me an accomplice in robbing my own father. It wasn't robbery, Brandon insisted, his mask finally slipping completely. It was intelligent redistribution of resources. Mark has no more than 10 years to live. Why should he waste millions while our baby grows up in poverty? Every word that came out of his mouth dug her grave deeper. Jessica recoiled as if he were a poisonous snake. Get out of my house, she said in a voice she didn't recognize. Get out now. Jessica, you can't be serious. We're married. You're pregnant with my child. Get out, she shouted with a force that made the neighbors turn on their lights. Brandon looked at me one last time, searching for some sign of mercy. But I had learned that premature mercy only allows predators to find new victims. Brandon, I said calmly, tomorrow morning, the banking authorities will receive complete evidence of her fraud. You have approximately 12 hours to hire a criminal lawyer. You can't do this to me, he whispered, but her voice had lost all its strength. Actually, I can. And I will. He ran out the door in a pathetic dash, leaving behind her pregnant wife and the life of lies he had built. Jessica collapsed into the kitchen chair, sobbing with an intensity that broke my heart. I approached her slowly and placed my hand on his shoulder. She said through her tears, I'm so sorry. How could I have been so blind? How could I have believed he instead of trusting you? Jessica, Brandon is a professional manipulator. He studied your vulnerabilities and exploited every one of them. This isn't her fault. But I hurt her, she insisted. I treated her like she was a burden instead of the amazing father she's always been. I sat down next to her and pulled her into a hug we hadn't shared in over 2 years. Jessica, you're my daughter. You always will be. And now you need to think about the baby. How am I going to raise a child on my own? I haven't had a job in a year. Brandon controlled all his finances. You're not going to raise this baby alone, I said firmly. You're going to raise it with his father, who has more than enough resources to ensure that you both have everything you need. In the weeks that followed, Brandon was arrested for bank fraud, conspiracy, and attempted financial exploitation of the elderly. The evidence Richard and I had compiled was so complete that he accepted a plea bargain to avoid an even more humiliating public trial. Jessica moved back home with me, and we converted the guest room into a nursery. For the first time in years, my house felt like a home again. 3 months later, I received an unexpected call. It was Brandon, calling from prison. Mark, I know you have no reason to listen to him, but I need to say something. I listened in silence. You were right about me. I'm manipulative. I'm greedy. And I destroyed the best thing in my life for money. Jessica and the baby deserve so much better. Brandon, why are you telling me this? Because I want to do the only right thing I can do. I'm going to sign the papers to give up his parental rights. I don't want my son growing up visiting his father in prison or carrying his name. It was a difficult decision, but I respected her choice. 6 months later, my grandson Oliver was born healthy and perfect. When I held him for the first time in the hospital, I realized that Brandon had given me a gift without knowing it, the chance to be the man this baby needed from day one. Jessica blossomed as a single mother with support. She returned to college to finish his MBA, which Brandon had convinced her to abandon. She discovered she had a natural talent for investment management and now manages part of his portfolio. Dad, she told me on Oliver's first birthday, thank you for not giving up on me when I gave up on him. A year later, I turned my experience into a greater cause. I created the Thompson Foundation for the Protection of the Elderly Against Family Abuse, which has already helped more than 300 families in similar situations. My first case was that of a 70-year-old man whose children were trying to have him declared incompetent so they could sell her house and divide the money. I used the same legal and investigative resources I had used against Brandon. The difference is that now I use my wealth and experience to protect others, rather than just defend myself. As for the Camaro Brandon coveted so much, I still have it. Oliver loves it when we go for Sunday drives, the wind messing up his curly hair while he laughs in the back seat. Brandon served 18 months in prison and now works a minimum wage job in another city. I hear he's in therapy and trying to rebuild his life honestly. I sincerely hope he succeeds. I've learned that true revenge isn't about destroying someone, but refusing to be destroyed yourself. Brandon tried to turn him into a helpless victim, but he only taught him the real value of protecting what's important. Today, at 66, I have a daughter who respects me, a grandson who adores me, and a mission that gives purpose to my golden years. I still work at the auto shop 3 days a week because I enjoy the simplicity of working with my hands. The difference is that now I choose that simplicity from a position of strength, not necessity. If this story touched his heart and showed him how patience and wisdom can overcome greed and manipulation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of people who refuse to be victims and turn their pain into purpose. In the end, Brandon achieved something he always wanted. He taught her about her true value. Just not in the way he expected. The last time I saw him, he was working at a gas station on the highway. He recognized her Camaro immediately. Our eyes met for a moment through the glass. There was no anger there, no revenge. Just mutual recognition between two people who had learned very different lessons about the price of the choices we make. I gently accelerated and continued on my journey, knowing that some chapters of life close forever, and that's okay.